Now let's take a look at your lesson question. How did the development of the railroads lead to the growth of other industries in the United States? Well, in your warm-up, you learned about how the railroads were expanding across America in the early 1800s. But now it's time to think about how to answer your lesson question. First, you need to know how the railroads developed themselves, and then you need to know how they helped other industries to develop. And you'll start by looking at how the railroads changed themselves. Take a closer look at your lesson question. If you wanted to answer this question well, where would you need to start? Well, the first question you need to ask is, how did the railroads develop? Before we can understand how they helped other industries, we need to focus on how the railroads changed and improved themselves. Then you'll be ready to look at how they helped other industries to expand and to grow. But first, we're going to focus on how the railroads improved and developed themselves. I want you to imagine that you were living in Seattle, Washington. What if you wanted to call your family in Memphis, Tennessee? How would you know if it was too late to call your family? You would rely on time zones, right? Well, Memphis, Tennessee is 2 hours ahead of Seattle, Washington, which means it's 2 hours later there. But what if Memphis got to decide its own time? How would you know what time it was there? Well, in the 1800s, this was a real problem because time zones hadn't been created yet. In the early 1800s, no system existed to compare times in different parts of the region. The US hadn't developed a way of keeping track of this in an organized way, and as the country expanded across the continent, this became a real problem. All time was measured locally. So if you weren't at home, how would you know what time it was back at home? Well, another problem was that companies could also decide what time it was for themselves. One company might say that it was 5 o'clock, while another company would insist that it was actually 6 o'clock. The railroad companies needed standardization. Standardization is the removal of differences. Things needed to be uniform in order for the railroads to cooperate with one another. So to solve this problem, the nation's railroads held the General Time Convention in 1883.
In the early 1800s, there was no clear time system across the US. Time was only measured locally. The nation was quickly growing, so this was a problem. As you can imagine, it was incredibly confusing if you were trying to go from one place to another. So, in 1883, basic time zones were set up. From west to east, they were labeled Pacific, Mountain, Central, and Eastern. Some states had more than one time zone. Check out the states that have two colors. Alaska and Hawaii were set up with their own time zones. Because people wanted or needed to travel from one part of the country to another, standard time zones, or the time zones everyone accepted, helped with train schedules. Now, the train schedules of different rail companies became better organized. If you were traveling from New York to California, it was much easier. The time zones became official in 1918 when Congress passed the Standard Time Act. But there was another problem the railroads faced: the train tracks. Let's take a look at that. A train had to be specially built to run on tracks like this one. But rail companies were all building their tracks at different sizes. So what if a train came to a section of track that was too wide or too narrow? It wouldn't be able to use that next section of track. That could mess up a trip very quickly. So, the rail companies had to standardize by creating rails or tracks with the same gauge. In other words, the rails had to be the same distance apart from each other. Then, companies could use each other's tracks. It took a lot of thinking and work, but standardizing time zones in railways was worth it. Standardization, or agreeing on one system, has real benefits. Without it, communication and travel in the growing United States would have been complicated, costly, or even impossible.
standardization wasn't the only way that the railroads improved. Inventors also found ways to improve the trains themselves, and this made them more safe and it made them more attractive to use. In the early days of the railroad, the trains were stopped using hand operated brakes, and crew members would have to move from car to car to use the brakes. And if they made a mistake, the train could easily crash or even derail. So in 1869, an inventor named George Westinghouse created a set of brakes that operated automatically. These were called air brakes. His system reduced the chances for human error and it made it much safer to stop a train. In fact, later, laws required that all trains use his invention. Now, you probably know that a train is a series of cars connected to one another. Well, old systems of connecting the cars together were very unsafe. It was way too easy for workers to be crushed or injured as they pushed the metal carts together while they were still moving. In 1873, another inventor named Eli Janey patented a new way of connecting the rail cars. He called this a knuckle coupler. Now, this let the cars automatically connect as they were being pushed together. It was much safer and it was much easier to connect the cars, making it easier to get the trains moving. Railroads also worked to become more versatile, and this meant that they could be used for new purposes. Before 1865, if you traveled for a long distance or if you had to go overnight on a train, then you had to sleep on your seat. And usually at the time, this was only like a long wooden bench. So in 1865, George Pullman started a company to build a new type of rail car, one that people could sleep in more comfortably. The car had fold-down beds, and this made it much more comfortable to travel for long distances, especially overnight. Along with passengers, trains carried food, but food can spoil quickly. So in 1877, a businessman named Gustavus Swift began to use refrigerator cars that were built to keep its contents cool. And this let Americans send meats and other foods over long distances. Okay, here's your lesson question again. How did the development of the railroads lead to the growth of other industries in the United States? You've already started to answer the first part of this question because we looked at how railroads became safer, more reliable, and more versatile. So now it's time to take a look at how the railroads helped other industries to develop. We're first going to start out by taking a look at how railroads helped the iron and steel industry. In the 1800s, the United States was rich in natural resources, but as you can see, those resources were spread out across the country. Deposits of mineral resources were often far from major manufacturing centers. But railroad expansion made a difference. It helped Americans access these natural resources, and railways carried these resources to growing cities. So not only did the railroads start allowing us to move raw materials from one spot to another spot, it also drove up the demand for those raw materials. The railroads needed wood for the railroad ties, they needed iron and steel to make more rails and to make more train cars, and they also needed coal to start fueling the locomotives. The more railroads that there were meant that more tracks and more locomotives needed to be built. And this meant that there needed to be more production of these raw materials in order to build more railroads. So are you starting to see like the cycle of growth going on? So as the railroads carried resources from place to place, they helped industries start to take off for the reasons that you just saw. So here are three major examples. Petroleum became a major resource in the United States in the 1800s. Railways carried petroleum from oil wells to cities, where it was refined and used to make many other products, including kerosene. In cities, oil refineries sprouted up to help take raw petroleum and turn it into fuels and plastics. The coal industry also benefited greatly from the railroads. Coal provided heat, it powered factories, and especially it fueled locomotives, and it generated electricity. Railroads helped to open up coal fields that weren't accessible before. The more accessible coal became, the more Americans used it. Finally, the iron and steel industries benefited as well. In Pennsylvania in the 1870s, railways carried iron ore to mills where it could be refined or used to make steel. American cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Birmingham became major centers of iron and steel production. Every industry followed the same pattern. Railroads helped transport raw materials so industries could refine these materials and sell them to eager buyers. These new resources began to pour into America's cities. Manufacturing took off quickly. Cities became manufacturing centers that processed raw materials. And not surprisingly, cities began to specialize in areas where these resources were common. Let's take a look at our map. Iron ore from around Lake Superior and in the southeast led to the rise of the steel industry, especially in places like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Birmingham, Alabama. Abundant coal deposits also helped to fuel the steel industry. The more that these manufacturing cities grew, the bigger American industry became. Before we move on, you should know why the growth of these industries made such a big difference. So let's focus on iron and steel. Inventors like the English engineer Henry Bessemer developed processes to remove impurities from iron and steel. This helped Americans make even better use of the resources that they were able to harvest. Steel ingots, like the ones that you see here, began to be used in construction. Steel became one of the most important building materials in the world. As it became more affordable and more common, it was used for rails, trains, buildings, and bridges. Americans built towering skyscrapers, massive bridges, and huge buildings. Steel began to shape our cities, and it still does today. As the steel industry grew, it became dominant worldwide. So let's check the numbers. This table shows the amount of steel produced in the world in 1900. Before the time period you see in this chart, the United Kingdom led the world. But thanks in part to the railroads, the United States began to catch up. If you do the math, you can see that the United States was creating almost twice as much steel as the other countries could. In fact, it was over a third of the steel that was being produced in the world, 36%. This is a very dominant industry. Another look at our lesson question. How did the development of the railroads lead to growth of other industries in the U.S.? Now, we've started answering a lot of that question, and we just got done talking about how railroads made it easier to transport resources, especially in the industries of iron and steel. But those were the only two industries that the railroad helped. We're going to continue on now by discussing how the railroads helped grains and meats. Railroads had a huge impact on land in the West. In fact, in order for the railroad to be built, the U.S. government gave land to railroad companies to help support their construction. The railroad companies used this land in three basic ways: using land to build track, which stretched across America, selling land to farmers and ranchers who were moving west to settle, and building towns to help settlement happen along the rail lines. The shaded areas on the map show just how much land was granted to railroads as they stretched across America. As the railroads moved west and east from California, Americans had new opportunities. By the mid 1800s, Americans were beginning to settle the Great Plains out west. Most American cities were still in the East, with a few exceptions. Railroads made a big difference because they created a connection between these regions. Railroads carried farmers and settlers west, where they could buy land, get a homestead, and have support from railroad towns. And then railroads would carry the crops east, back to the growing cities that needed food. As you can see, an agricultural industry was growing. As railroads brought crops and foods to cities, they helped new food industries grow. Let's look at an example, flour mills. As trains traveled back and forth from the plains to cities, they brought grain to flour mills and carried flour to markets. The pictures you see here show an example of how this helped one city to grow. These photos show Minneapolis, Minnesota, a city that was founded in 1867. The Pillsbury flour mills in Minneapolis, shown here, were the first in the United States to use steel rollers for processing grain. To transport the finished product, the company's owners helped develop the region's railroads. By the 1880s, there were 18 flour mills, and Minneapolis was the flour milling capital of the world. By bringing raw materials to cities, railroads helped cities like Minneapolis to grow. Another major industry that the railroads helped was the meat packing industry. As railroads stretched across the plains, they became easy ways for ranchers to transport cattle. Before the railroads, ranchers would have to take cattle on long cattle drives. But as railroads expanded, this became less necessary. Ranchers on the plains would send cattle to Midwestern cities where meat would be processed. And then the meat would be sent on to other major cities to be sold in stores. As railroads brought more cattle to processing plants and stockyards in growing cities, the meat packing industry exploded. And when this happened, these cities exploded in population too. Cities like Chicago, Kansas City, Cincinnati, and Omaha all owe much of their early growth to this industry. Gustavus Swift's refrigerated train cars, something you saw earlier in this lesson, revolutionized the meat industry. Fresh meat could now be processed in the Midwest and safely shipped across the country.